Sometimes the loneliest place is in a room full of people. Eleanor Briggs knows that feeling well, widowed for 3 years, raising her children alone on the Montana frontier, watching them grow up and leave one by one. Tonight, at a prairie supper outside town, she sits by herself while couples dance and neighbors laugh under the lanterns. Then Silas Boone, the wealthiest cattleman in 3 counties, leans down and whispers words she never expected. "Pretend I'm your husband tonight." It's a simple request, meant to quiet the gossip and whispers. But as the evening unfolds, something tender shifts between 2 people who thought their time for love had already passed them by. What happens when 2 lonely hearts stop pretending and start hoping again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning came quiet over Eleanor Briggs's homestead, the way it always did these days. No children's voices called from the loft. No husband's boots scraped across the wooden floor. Just Eleanor and the old rooster announcing dawn from somewhere near the hen house, punctual as ever, indifferent to whether anyone particularly cared. She rose from the narrow bed. She still couldn't bring herself to center in the room. 3 years since Thomas died, and she still slept on her side, leaving space for a man who'd never fill it again. Foolish, perhaps, but habits built over 22 years of marriage didn't break easy. Didn't break at all, maybe. The floor was cold beneath her feet, though it was late spring of 1887, and the Montana Territory was finally shaking off winter's grip. Eleanor wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and moved to the window. The view hadn't changed. Never did. 40 acres of prairie grass bending in the morning wind, the small barn Thomas had built with his own hands, the fence line that needed mending again. It always needed mending, beyond her property, past the creek that marked her eastern boundary. The land rolled out toward Clearwater, a prairie town of maybe 300 souls, give or take whoever'd recently arrived seeking fortune or fled seeking anonymity. Montana Territory drew both kinds. Thomas had been the former. He'd come west with dreams of cattle and land, brought Eleanor as his bride, and built this small piece of the world with determination and sweat. He'd succeeded, too, in his modest way. The homestead was paid for. They'd raised 3 children who'd survived infancy, no small feat out here. He'd been respected in town, known as a fair man and a hard worker. Then one day he'd been fixing the barn roof, and one day he'd fallen, and one day he'd been gone. Just like that. 22 years of marriage, of partnership, of building a life, ended in the time it took for old wood to give way beneath his weight. Eleanor turned from the window and began her morning routine. Fire in the stove, kettle on to boil, yesterday's coffee grounds mixed with today's to make them stretch further. Money wasn't desperate, not yet, but it wasn't easy either. Thomas had left her the homestead clear, and there was a small sum saved, but 40 acres wasn't enough to run cattle profitably, and farming alone was work she couldn't manage. She kept chickens, sold eggs in town, took in mending when offered, taught a few children their letters in exchange for firewood or flour or whatever folks could spare. She survived. That was the word for it. She'd stopped living and started surviving, and some days she couldn't tell if there was supposed to be a difference. The kettle whistled. Eleanor poured water over the coffee grounds and waited for it to steep. Standing at the counter Thomas had planed smooth. In the kitchen they'd painted together one spring when Ada was just a baby. Everywhere she looked were memories, and she didn't know if they comforted or haunted her. Maybe both. The sound of hoofbeats brought her head up. Visitors were rare this early, and her hand instinctively went to the rifle mounted above the door before she recognized the horse. It was Samuel's bay gelding, and her middle child, her only son, swung down from the saddle with the easy grace of a man who spent more time on horseback than on foot. "Morning." "Ma," Samuel called, tying the horse to the porch rail. At 23, he was the image of his father, tall and lean, with the same sun-weathered face and careful eyes. But where Thomas had been steady as stone, Samuel was restless. He worked cattle drives, following the herds north to Canada or south to railheads, never staying put for more than a few weeks at a time. "You're up early," Eleanor said, opening the door to him. Or you haven't been to bed yet. Haven't been to bed. He grinned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Just finished a drive to Helena. Thought I'd stop by before heading back out. There's coffee. There's always coffee. He followed her inside, removing his hat and hanging it by the door. His movements were too familiar, too temporary. He'd be gone again by afternoon. They sat at the table, and Eleanor poured him a cup. He wrapped his hands around it and stared into the dark liquid like it held answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. "You doing all right, Ma?" "I'm managing." "That's not what I asked." Eleanor met her son's eyes. She saw concern there and guilt and the trapped feeling of a young man who loved his mother but couldn't stay to help her. Wouldn't stay. Staying meant putting down roots, and Samuel had watched his father die, building a life in one place. He'd decided, without ever saying it out loud, that he wouldn't make the same choice. "I'm doing all right," she said, softer this time. "The chickens are laying well. Mrs. Henderson bought 24 eggs last week. Ada's helping with the garden. Ada's 17, Ma. She'll be leaving soon, too." "I know." They sat in silence for a while. The coffee cooled. Outside, the rooster crowed again, late this time, having apparently forgotten his duties earlier. "Margaret sent a letter," Samuel said finally. "She and William are doing well in Billings. She's expecting again. Eleanor's eldest daughter, married at 19 to a shopkeeper's son." Margaret wrote faithfully, long letters full of details about her life in Billings, a real city with brick buildings and streetlights and opportunities Thomas had always promised they'd have someday. Margaret had found them by marrying up and moving away. "That'll be their third," Eleanor said, "fourth. She lost one last year, remember?" Eleanor did remember. She'd travelled to Billings, stayed a month helping Margaret through the grief of a stillbirth. It had been winter, the journey hard, and she'd come home to find the hen house raided by foxes and half her flock gone. Life took with one hand while you were busy watching what the other one was doing. "I'm glad she's happy," Eleanor said, and meant it. Whatever regrets she carried about her own life, her children's happiness wasn't among them. They'd each found their way. That was something. Samuel finished his coffee and stood. "I should get going. Trail boss wants us ready to head south by week's end. You'll be careful." "Always am." He kissed her forehead, settled his hat back on his head, and paused at the door. "Ma, there's a prairie supper Saturday night. You should go." "I don't think you should go. Ada will want to, and you shouldn't make her stay home on your account." His voice was gentle but firm. "It's not healthy, staying out here alone all the time." After he left, Eleanor stood on the porch and watched him ride away until he disappeared over the rise. The prairie swallowed him up the way it swallowed everything eventually, distance turning substance into shadow, then into nothing at all. She went back inside and found Ada awake. Coming down from the loft, where she still slept in the room she'd shared with Margaret before her sister married. Ada was 17, caught in that strange space between girl and woman, still lanky and uncertain, but with her mother's strong features beginning to settle into beauty. She had Thomas's colouring, dark hair and darker eyes, but Eleanor's sharp intelligence. "Was that Samuel?" Ada asked, yawning, "Just passing through." "He's heading south with another drive." Ada nodded, unsurprised. She busied herself with breakfast, slicing bread and setting out the butter they'd churned earlier in the week. They moved around each other easily, a routine practiced over years. This small kitchen barely fit 2 people, but they'd learned its rhythms. "The prairie supper's Saturday," Ada said, not quite casual. "Mrs. Hendricks mentioned it yesterday when I was in town." "I heard. We should go. Ada, Mama, please." Ada set down the knife and turned to face her mother. "I'm leaving for Helena in August. I've been accepted at the normal school. I'll be gone 2 years learning to teach, and then I'll get placed somewhere, and I don't know when I'll be back." The words struck deeper than Eleanor expected. She'd known Ada wanted to teach. They'd discussed it, planned for it even. But hearing it stated so plainly, with a date attached, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I know that. Then let's go to the supper. Let's do something nice while we still can. Please, Mama, I don't want to spend our last few months hiding out here like we're ashamed of something." Eleanor looked at her youngest child, her baby, nearly grown and ready to fly. When had that happened? When had Ada stopped being the little girl who'd cried at thunderstorms and started being this confident young woman who spoke her mind without apology? "All right," Eleanor said quietly. "We'll go." Ada's face lit up and she hugged her mother tight. Eleanor held her, breathing in the scent of her daughter's hair, trying to memorize the feeling of being needed, being wanted, being someone's whole world. Soon enough, Ada would have students to tend and a life to build, and Eleanor would be truly alone. The days between Samuel's visit and Saturday's prairie supper passed in the usual rhythm of work. Chickens fed and eggs collected, garden weeded and watered, vents mended where the cattle from the neighboring ranch had pushed through again, bread baked, clothes washed, the endless small tasks that filled a life and meant nothing and everything all at once. Friday afternoon, Martha Hendricks stopped by with a basket of early strawberries, and news she was clearly bursting to share. "Eleanor Briggs, you're coming tomorrow night, aren't you?" Martha was a round, cheerful woman, 10 years Eleanor's senior, widowed herself, but remarried to a man who ran the feed store in Clearwater. She'd been a good friend to Eleanor, the kind who knew when to talk and when to listen, Ada insisted. "Good for Ada. It's about time you rejoined the living, dear." 3 years is long enough to wear black. Eleanor glanced down at her dress. It wasn't black anymore, hadn't been for over a year, but it was grey and plain and practical. Widow's clothes, even if they weren't mourning clothes. She'd packed away the calico dresses she'd worn when Thomas was alive, the ones with flowers or checks or any color that suggested joy. They felt wrong now, presumptuous somehow. "I'm coming," Eleanor said. "That's enough." Martha's expression softened. "I know it's hard, honey, but you're only 42 years old. That's not old. You've got a lot of life left to live. I'm living it, are you?" Martha set the strawberries on the table and took Eleanor's hands. "Tom was a good man. You had a good marriage. But he's gone, and you're still here, and hiding out on this homestead isn't honoring his memory. It's just hiding." The words stung because they were true. Eleanor pulled her hands away, not angry, but unable to accept the comfort being offered. "I'll be there tomorrow," she said again. "With Ada." Martha sighed but nodded. "Wear something with a bit of color, will you? For my sake, if not yours." After Martha left, Eleanor went to the chest where she'd stored her old dresses. She opened it slowly, half expecting moths to have devoured everything, but the dresses were intact. She pulled out a blue calico, one Thomas had liked, and held it up to the window. The color seemed too bright, too optimistic. She folded it away and closed the chest. Saturday evening arrived whether she was ready or not. The prairie supper was held quarterly at the McGregor place, a prosperous spread 2 miles south of town. The McGregors had a barn big enough for dancing and land enough for tables and lanterns, and they were generous with both. The whole community came, farmers and ranchers, merchants and craftsmen, families and singles, old and young. It was the heartbeat of their small society, the place where business was discussed and marriages were made and neighbors remembered they were neighbors. Eleanor dressed in a simple brown skirt and cream blouse, the most color she could manage. Ada wore a yellow dress that made her look like sunshine, her dark hair braided and pinned up in a style that made her look older than 17. They rode to the McGregor place in the small wagon, following the line of other families, heading the same direction. The sun was setting when they arrived, painting the prairie gold and orange and pink. Lanterns were already lit, strung between posts and hanging from the barn eaves. Tables groaned under the weight of food everyone had brought. Roasted chickens and beef, fresh bread and butter, pies and cakes, early vegetables from gardens just beginning to produce. Someone had set up a small platform for musicians, and a fiddle was already tuning up, joined by a guitar and a harmonica. People called greetings as Eleanor and Ada added their contribution to the food tables. A strawberry pie made with Martha's berries and dried apple turnovers. Ada immediately spotted friends her age and drifted toward them, laughing at something Eleanor couldn't hear. She watched her daughter go, feeling both proud and lost. "Eleanor!" Martha appeared, her husband Floyd in tow. "Come sit with us. We've got a good spot near the music." Eleanor let herself be led to a table where several couples had already gathered. She knew them all, of course. In a town of 300, everyone knew everyone. There was Pastor Whitfield and his wife Grace, Mr. Chen from the Mercantile and his daughter May, the Johnsons who ran the hotel, and a few others. They welcomed her warmly, made space on the bench, passed her food she didn't want. She tried to be present, tried to smile and nod at the right moments, but she felt removed from it all. Around her, people were laughing and talking. Couples were leaning into each other. Children were running wild in that supervised chaos that happened when the whole community gathered. She was surrounded by life, by warmth, by connection, and she had never felt more alone. The music started. Couples moved to the dance area, and the fiddle began a lively reel. Eleanor watched Ada dance with a young man she didn't recognize, watched Martha and Floyd circle each other with the ease of long partnership, watched the Whitfields move sedately through the steps. Everyone had someone. Everyone belonged somewhere. She stood quietly and moved away from the table, seeking the edges of the gathering where the lantern light didn't quite reach. She found a quiet spot near a fence post and stood there, arms wrapped around herself, watching the party from a distance that felt safer than participation. That's when she heard the voice behind her. Mrs. Briggs. She turned. Silas Boone stood a few feet away, hat in his hands, his expression unreadable in the dim light. She knew who he was, of course. Everyone knew Silas Boone. He owned the Rocking Bee Ranch, one of the largest spreads in the territory, ran thousands of head of cattle, and employed half the drovers and ranch hands within 50 miles. He was wealthy by any measure, respected, and as far as Eleanor knew, completely alone. She'd seen him at church, at town gatherings, occasionally in the Mercantile. He was maybe 50 years old, tall and solid, with grey threading through dark hair and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his usual serious expression revealed. His wife, Catherine, had died 5 years ago, Eleanor remembered hearing. No children. He'd buried himself in his ranch after that, just like she'd buried herself in her homestead. Mr. Boone, she said. Uncertain why he'd sought her out, he stepped closer, and she could see his face better in the lantern light. There was kindness there and something else, something that looked like the same loneliness she felt. "I wonder if I might ask you something," he said quietly. "It's going to sound strange, and you're welcome to say no, but I'm going to ask anyway because I'm tired of the alternative." "All right." He took a breath, and then he said the words that would change everything. "Would you be willing to pretend I'm your husband tonight? Just for the evening. Just to keep the well-meaning folk from trying to fix what they think is broken." Eleanor stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "I know how it sounds." He glanced back at the party, at the people dancing and laughing. "But look at us. We're both alone. People have been trying for months to match us up with others, to arrange introductions, to fix our solitude. Pastor Whitfield cornered me last week with some widow from Billings he thought I should meet. Mrs. Henderson tried to introduce you to her cousin at church 2 Sundays ago. You remember?" Eleanor did remember. Martha's cousin, a man who talked incessantly about his digestive troubles and his late wife's cooking, neither topic appealing. "So you're proposing we, what? Pretend we're courting? Just for tonight? Just to give ourselves some peace? Stand next to me. Dance once or twice. Let people see us together and jump to their own conclusions. Tomorrow everything goes back to normal, but maybe they'll leave us alone for a while." It was absurd. It was presumptuous. It was also, Eleanor realized, the first interesting thing anyone had suggested to her in 3 years. She looked at Silas Boone, really looked at him. His hands were nervous on his hat brim. His eyes were honest. He wasn't trying to court her or trick her. He was just another lonely person, trying to make loneliness a little more bearable. "One evening," she said, "one evening, and then we go back to being strangers who nod. Politely in town, if that's what you want." Eleanor surprised herself by smiling just a little. "All right, Mr. Boone, I'll pretend you're my husband for one night." His relief was visible, his shoulders dropping as tension released. "Thank you, Mrs. Briggs. And please call me Silas if we're pretending. We should probably use first names. Eleanor, she said. Eleanor. He said her name like he was trying it on, seeing how it fit. Then he offered his arm. Shall we give them something to talk about? She hesitated only a moment before taking his arm. His sleeve was warm beneath her hand, solid and real. Together, they walked back toward the lantern light, toward the music and the people, and the life she'd been watching from the outside. As they emerged from the shadows, Martha Hendricks caught sight of them, and her eyes went wide. Within moments, Eleanor could see the ripple of awareness spreading through the crowd. People noticed. People whispered. People smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor didn't care what they thought. She was tired of being alone, tired of being the widow everyone pitied, tired of surviving instead of living. If pretending for one night gave her a taste of belonging again, maybe that was enough. Or maybe, she thought as Silas led her toward the dance floor, maybe it was just a beginning. The music shifted to something slower, and Silas's hand at Eleanor's elbow guided her gently toward the dance floor. She hadn't danced in years. Thomas had never been much for it, claiming 2 left feet and a rancher's stiff joints, though in their early years he'd occasionally obliged her at gatherings like this. After the children came, dancing had seemed frivolous, something for young people with energy to spare. Now, standing at the edge of the makeshift floor, while couples swayed to the fiddle's sweet, mournful melody, Eleanor felt every one of her 42 years. What was she doing? This was foolish. People would talk. They'd assume things. They'd having second thoughts. Silas's voice was quiet, meant only for her. Eleanor looked up at him. In the lantern light, she could see the silver at his temples, the weathered lines around his eyes, the slight stoop of shoulders that carried too much responsibility for too long. He looked tired. He looked lonely. He looked exactly how she felt. No, she said. No second thoughts. Then may I have this dance, Eleanor? She let him lead her onto the floor. His right hand found her waist, proper and respectful, while his left hand enclosed hers with a gentleness that surprised her. She rested her free hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the fabric of his jacket. They began to move, and Eleanor realized with a start that Silas Boone could dance. Not fancy, not showy, but with a quiet competence that suggested practice and care. He guided her through the steps with confidence, navigating around other couples, his movements sure, despite the pretense that had brought them here. Your wife taught you, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Silas nodded, his expression softening with memory. Catherine loved to dance. Said it was one of the few times I'd slow down enough to just be with her. She was patient about teaching me, though I stepped on her feet more times than I care to remember. Thomas hated dancing. Said it made him feel like a performing bear. Silas smiled at that. Sounds like an honest man. He was. Honest to a fault sometimes. He never learned to tell a polite lie, never understood why anyone would say something they didn't mean. Catherine was the opposite. She could charm anyone, smooth over any rough edge. I relied on that more than I probably should have. After she passed, I realized how much of my connection to people had been through her. Without her, I didn't know how to— He paused, seeming to search for words. How to be in the world, I suppose. Eleanor understood. She'd been Thomas's wife, Samuel and Margaret and Ada's mother, a member of the community by virtue of her roles and relationships. When Thomas died, she'd lost more than her husband. She'd lost her place in the order of things. How did she die? Eleanor asked, then immediately regretted the question. I'm sorry. That's too personal. No, it's all right. If we're pretending to be close, we should probably know these things about each other. He turned them smoothly to avoid another couple. She got sick. Nothing dramatic, just a fever that wouldn't break. Doctor tried everything, but sometimes the body just decides it's done, Eleanor finished. Thomas fell off the barn roof. Broke his neck. One moment he was alive, fixing shingles and whistling, and the next moment he was gone. I didn't even get to say goodbye. I'm sorry. So am I. About Catherine. They danced in silence for a while, and Eleanor became aware of eyes watching them. Martha was beaming from her table. Pastor Whitfield looked pleased. Mr. Chen gave her a subtle nod of approval. The whole community seemed to be silently celebrating this development, this widow and widower finally finding comfort in each other, if only they knew it was all pretense. Except it didn't feel like pretense. Silas's hand at her waist felt real. The warmth of his palm against hers felt real. The way they moved together, finding rhythm despite being strangers, felt more real than anything had in years. "Why did you really ask me to do this?" Eleanor said quietly. "The truth." Silas was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "I saw you standing alone out there, away from everyone. You looked the way I feel most days. Like you're watching life happen from behind glass, seeing it, but not part of it. And I thought, maybe we could stand behind that glass together for a few hours, make it feel less lonely." The honesty in his words struck something deep in Eleanor's chest. She'd spent 3 years trying to convince everyone, including herself, that she was fine, that she was managing, that widowhood was just another role she'd learned to play. But Silas had seen through it in moments. He'd recognized the isolation she wore like a second skin. "I don't know how to not be lonely anymore," she admitted, surprising herself with the confession. "I thought it would get easier with time, but it just gets more familiar. I'm good at it now, proficient. I understand that completely." The song ended, but another began immediately, and by unspoken agreement they kept dancing. Eleanor realized she didn't want to stop. When they'd been sitting separately, the loneliness had been bearable, because it was all she knew. But now, held in a man's arms again, swaying to music under lantern light, she remembered what she'd been missing. The simple human comfort of touch, of presence, of mattering to someone, even if just for a dance. "Do you regret it?" Silas asked. "Marrying Thomas? Coming out here?" "No, never." Eleanor's answer was immediate and certain. "He was a good man. We built a good life. I thought I'd have more time. We were supposed to grow old together, watch our grandchildren grow up, sit on the porch in our 70s, and argue about how to tell the same old stories. That was the plan. Catherine and I had similar plans. We were going to travel once we'd built the ranch into something that could run without us. She wanted to see San Francisco, maybe even take a ship to Hawaii. She had a whole list." His voice caught slightly. "I found it after she died, tucked in her Bible. All the places she wanted to go. All the things we never got to do. Do you still have the list?" "I do. Can't bring myself to throw it away, but I can't look at it either. It just sits in a drawer, a reminder of all the some days that never came." Eleanor understood. She had her own drawer full of some days. Fabric Thomas had bought her to make a new dress, lumber he'd ordered for expanding the house, plans they'd sketched for a real barn. All of it gathering dust, monuments to a future that died with him. The music slowed even further, and couples pulled closer. Silas's hand tightened slightly at Eleanor's waist, asking permission. She moved closer, close enough to rest her head against his shoulder if she wanted to. She didn't, not quite, but the possibility was there. "Comforting in itself. This is dangerous," Eleanor murmured. "What is?" "This pretending. It feels too much like remembering." "Remembering what?" "What it's like to not be alone. Tomorrow, when we go back to our separate lives, it's going to hurt more than before, knowing what we're missing." Silas was quiet for several measures of music. Then he said, "Maybe. Or maybe it'll remind us that we're still alive, still capable of connection. That loneliness doesn't have to be permanent." Eleanor wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that this small taste of companionship wouldn't just make the silence at her homestead feel louder. But she'd learned the hard way that hope was dangerous. It set you up for disappointment, for the kind of pain that came when you wanted something you couldn't have. "My daughter's leaving in August," she said, changing the subject to something safer. "Teaching school in Helena. I'll be alone then. Truly alone. That must be frightening." "It is. But I can't ask her to stay. She has her whole life ahead of her. She shouldn't have to spend it taking care of her mother." "You have other children?" "Margaret in Billings. Married, expecting her 4th child. Samuel works cattle drives, never stays in one place long. They've all moved on the way they should. I'm proud of them, but you miss them every day." The song ended. This time no new one immediately began. The musicians were taking a break, calling for refreshments. Around them, couples separated, moved back to tables, called to friends. The spell of the music broke, and suddenly Eleanor was acutely aware that she was standing very close to a man she barely knew, in front of the entire community, while they all watched with knowing smiles. "I should check on Ada," Eleanor said. Stepping back, Silas's hands released her slowly, reluctantly. Of course, but before she could walk away, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a silver pocket watch. Even in the lantern light, Eleanor could see it was expensive, beautifully engraved. Silas turned it over in his hands, running his thumb over the initials on the back, CB. "This was Catherine's," he said quietly. "I've carried it since she died. Couldn't wear my own watch anymore. It felt wrong somehow, like I was trying to move forward when I should be standing still." Eleanor didn't know what to say. The gesture felt significant, this sharing of grief and memory with a woman he'd just met. "I'm telling you this because—" Silas paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because tonight, dancing with you, I didn't think about the watch once. Didn't check it, didn't touch it for comfort. I was just present, here for the first time in 5 years. I wasn't living in the past. Silas, I know we agreed this was just pretend, just for tonight. And if that's all you want, I'll respect that. Tomorrow we'll nod politely in town and go our separate ways. But Eleanor, if you'd be willing, I'd like to do this again. Not pretending, just two lonely people trying to be a little less lonely together." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. This was happening too fast. They'd danced twice. They'd talked for maybe 20 minutes. This wasn't how things were done. There were rules, protocols, a proper amount of time for grieving before even considering. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know if I'm ready for whatever this might become." "I don't either," Silas admitted. "But I know I'd like to find out." "No promises, no expectations. Just may I call on you properly? Take you to Sunday dinner maybe? Let us see if what we felt tonight is real or just two people fooling themselves." Eleanor looked into his eyes, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Hope, tentative, fragile, barely acknowledged, but there. The same hope she felt stirring in her own chest, dangerous and compelling all at once. Around them the party continued. Ada was laughing with friends. Martha and Floyd were eating pie. The musicians tuned their instruments for the next set. Life moved on, whether you participated or not. Whether you took risks or played it safe, whether you opened yourself to possibility or locked yourself away in grief. Thomas was gone. Catherine was gone. But Eleanor and Silas were still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling something other than absence. "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "Or you may call on me." The smile that broke across Silas's face transformed him. The tired, lonely widower disappeared, replaced by a man who suddenly looked 10 years younger. He caught her hand, squeezed it gently, and Eleanor felt the pressure of his palm against hers, like a promise. "Sunday, then. I'll come by around 11 if that suits you." "That suits me fine." They stood there another moment, neither quite willing to break the connection. Then Ada called out to her mother from across the yard, and the spell broke. Eleanor withdrew her hand from Silas's, smoothed her skirt, and turned to go. But before she took more than a few steps, she glanced back over her shoulder. Silas was still standing where she'd left him, watching her go, his expression soft and wondering. He touched his hat brim in acknowledgement, and Eleanor found herself smiling as she walked away, pretending she'd agreed to. Just for one night. But as she made her way through the crowd to her daughter, Eleanor acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding all evening. She hadn't been pretending at all. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the disorienting sensation that something had changed. For a moment, still caught in the haze between sleep and waking, she couldn't place what felt different. Then memory returned. The prairie supper, Silas Boone dancing under the lanterns, his quiet invitation and her even quieter acceptance. She sat up slowly, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. What had she done? She'd agreed to let a man she barely knew call on her, a wealthy, respected rancher who could have his choice of women, who for some inexplicable reason had chosen her, a struggling widow with 40 acres and 3 grown children who'd all found reasons to leave. The morning light felt too bright, too revealing. In the darkness of evening, with music and lanterns creating their own small world, saying yes had felt possible, natural even. But now, in the stark reality of Sunday morning, Eleanor questioned everything. Her judgment, her motives, her right to feel anything other than loyalty to Thomas's memory. She rose and dressed, moving quietly so as not to wake Ada. The house was cool, and Eleanor wrapped her shawl around her shoulders as she descended to the kitchen. She built up the fire in the stove and put coffee on, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind spun in unfamiliar directions. What would she wear when Silas came? What would they talk about? What did a proper courtship even look like at her age? She'd been 18 when she married Thomas, barely more than a girl. Now she was a middle-aged woman with a lifetime of experience and a heart that had learned to protect itself through scar tissue and distance. The coffee began to brew, filling the kitchen with its bitter, comforting scent. Eleanor poured herself a cup and moved to the kitchen window, looking out at her small homestead in the morning light. 40 acres that represented everything she and Thomas had built together. The barn where he'd died, the garden where they'd worked side by side, the fence line he'd spent years perfecting, which now needed constant repair because she couldn't maintain it alone. Standing here, she could almost feel his presence, almost hear his voice telling her the rooster needed to be culled, the hen house needed cleaning. The west pasture fence had 3 posts rotting that needed replacing before winter. Thomas had always been thinking 3 seasons ahead, planning and building toward a future he'd never see. Would he mind? Would he think her disloyal for entertaining another man's attention? Or would he, practical as always, tell her not to be foolish, that life was for the living and she still had years ahead of her? Eleanor would never know. The dead kept their counsel, left the living to stumble through without guidance. She was still standing at the window, lost in thought, when she noticed something on the front porch. A small object, placed carefully on the top step where she couldn't miss it when she went out. Eleanor set down her coffee and went to investigate. It was a wildflower, pressed flat and placed between 2 pieces of folded paper. The paper was good quality, the kind you'd use for business correspondence or important letters. And when Eleanor unfolded it carefully, she found the flower preserved perfectly, a Montana bitterroot with its pale pink petals spread wide. Below the flower, in neat, careful handwriting, were just 3 words: "Thank you, Silas." Eleanor stood on her porch in her nightgown and shawl, holding the pressed flower, and felt something crack open in her chest. It was such a simple gesture, so thoughtful, so carefully done. He'd picked the flower, pressed it properly between papers, and ridden all the way out here before dawn to leave it where she'd find it. He'd been thinking of her. While she'd been lying awake, questioning everything, he'd been thinking of her. The crack in her chest widened, and Eleanor realized with a start that it wasn't pain she was feeling. It was hope. Dangerous, terrifying, completely inappropriate hope. But hope nonetheless. She was still standing there, staring at the flower, when Ada emerged from the house wrapped in a quilt, her hair loose and tangled from sleep. "Mama, what are you doing out here?" "It's freezing." Ada stopped, seeing the paper in her mother's hands. "What's that?" Eleanor couldn't seem to find words. She simply handed the paper to her daughter and watched Ada's face transform as she read the simple note and saw the pressed flower. "Mama." Ada's voice was soft, full of something that sounded like joy. "Mr. Boone left this for you?" "He must have. I found it on the step, but that means he came all the way out here this morning." "That's—" Ada looked at her mother with wide eyes. "That's courting behavior, Mama, real courting." "I know. And what? And how do you feel about it?" Ada moved closer, still clutching the quilt around her shoulders. "I saw you dancing with him last night. You looked happy, really happy for the first time in—" "Ada, don't. Why not? Why can't I say it? Papa's been gone 3 years, Mama. 3 years of watching you disappear a little more every day. And last night, dancing with Mr. Boone, you looked like yourself again. Like the mother I remember from before." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if it's right. Right for who? Papa wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone. You know he wouldn't. It's not that simple. Why not? Ada's voice was gentle but insistent. Mama, I'm leaving in August. Margaret's in Billings. Samuel's never here. You're going to be alone in this house, working yourself to exhaustion, trying to keep a homestead running that's too much for one person. If Mr. Boone is offering companionship, maybe even help, why would you refuse that? Because I'm frightened, Eleanor admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I'm frightened of forgetting your father, of dishonoring his memory, of letting someone else into the life we built together. What if I'm not ready? What if I can't? Ada set down the paper with its pressed flower and wrapped her arms around her mother. At 17, she was nearly as tall as Eleanor now, and strong from farm work. She held her mother tight, and Eleanor let herself be held, let herself lean on her youngest child one more time. You could never dishonor Papa's memory, Ada said firmly. He loved you. He'd want you to be happy, and Mama, you deserve to be happy. You deserve companionship and help and maybe even love again, if that's what this becomes. Don't deny yourself that out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to the past. Eleanor pulled back, wiping her eyes. When did you get so wise? I learned from you, Ada smiled. Now come inside before we both freeze. You have a gentleman caller coming this afternoon, and we need to make you presentable. He's not coming until 11. Then we have 5 hours to prepare. That's barely enough time. Despite everything, Eleanor laughed. It felt rusty, unfamiliar, but good. When was the last time she'd laughed? She couldn't remember. They went inside, and Ada took charge in a way that made Eleanor realize her daughter had been waiting for this. Waiting for her mother to show some sign of life, some willingness to move forward. Ada bustled around the kitchen, insisting on a proper breakfast. Eggs and bacon and fresh bread, while Eleanor sat at the table. Still holding the pressed flower. You should wear the blue calico, Ada said, scrambling eggs. Papa always loved you in that dress. It's been packed away for 3 years. It probably smells like cedar and mothballs. Then we'll air it out. Hang it in the sunshine. By 11 it'll be perfect. Eleanor wanted to protest, to say this was all too much fuss for what might amount to nothing. But Ada's enthusiasm was infectious, and truthfully, Eleanor didn't want to stop her. It felt good to have her daughter excited about something. It felt good to have something to be excited about. After breakfast, they spent the morning in a flurry of preparation that felt both ridiculous and necessary. The blue calico dress was retrieved from its cedar chest, hung outside to air in the spring breeze. Eleanor washed her hair, and Ada helped her pin it up in a style more refined than her usual simple bun. They cleaned the small parlor, swept the porch, even picked fresh wildflowers to place in a jar on the table. By the time 11 o'clock approached, Eleanor was dressed in the blue calico, her hair arranged, the house spotless. She stood at the window, watching the road, her stomach full of butterflies that had no business being there at her age. He'll come, Ada said, reading her mother's nervousness. He left you that flower. He'll come, and he did. At precisely 11 o'clock, Eleanor heard hoofbeats and saw Silas Boone riding up the path to her homestead. He sat tall in the saddle, dressed in his Sunday best, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. Eleanor's breath caught. This was real. This was happening. A man was coming to court her, and she was going to let him, and maybe, just maybe, she was going to allow herself to hope for something beyond mere survival. Ada squeezed her mother's hand. Go answer the door, Mama. Your future is waiting. Eleanor moved to the door, smoothed her dress one last time, and opened it to find Silas Boone standing on her porch, flowers in hand. His expression equal parts hopeful and nervous. Eleanor, he said, and his voice carried everything, gratitude, anticipation, the fragile beginning of something neither of them could yet name. Silas, she replied. Thank you for the pressed flower. It was beautiful. Not nearly as beautiful as you look right now, and despite her fears, despite her guilt, despite every reason she had to protect her heart, Eleanor smiled. The visit lasted through Sunday dinner, stretching into afternoon, and by the time Silas finally took his leave, the sun was slanting westward, and Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years. They really talked about everything and nothing. Their childhoods, their marriages, their children, their hopes and regrets. Silas had been funny in a dry, understated way that made Eleanor laugh more than she'd expected. And when he'd asked if he might call again, she'd said yes without hesitation. The week that followed passed in a haze of anticipation. Silas came by Wednesday evening with a broken hinge he claimed needed fixing, though Eleanor suspected the hinge had been fine until he'd deliberately loosened it. He stayed for coffee and conversation, their talk flowing as easily as it had on Sunday. Friday, he appeared with fresh trout from the creek that ran through his property, and Eleanor fried them up for dinner, while Ada watched with barely concealed delight at her mother's flushed cheeks and soft smiles. The following Sunday, Silas invited both Eleanor and Ada to his ranch for dinner. It was a proper invitation, delivered with all appropriate formality, and Eleanor accepted with a mix of nervousness and curiosity. She'd heard of the Rocking Bee Ranch, of course, everyone had. It was one of the largest spreads in the territory, thousands of acres of prime grazing land stretching along the valley. But she'd never been there, never had reason to see what Silas Boone had built. They arrived at midday, their small wagon following the well-maintained road that led to the ranch headquarters. Eleanor's first glimpse of the property took her breath away. The main house was substantial, 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides and glass windows that gleamed in the sunlight. Beyond it stretched a network of barns, corrals, bunkhouses, and outbuildings, all well-kept and purposeful. Dozens of horses grazed in nearby pastures, and in the distance, Eleanor could see cattle dotting the hillsides. This wasn't just a ranch. It was an empire. "Mama," Ada whispered, eyes wide. "This is incredible." Eleanor nodded, unable to find words. The contrast between this prosperous spread and her own struggling 40 acres was stark. What was Silas doing courting her? What could she possibly offer a man who had all this? But then Silas appeared on the porch, his face lighting up when he saw them, and Eleanor's doubts faded. The way he looked at her had nothing to do with land or cattle or wealth. It was simpler than that, and deeper. 2 people who understood each other's loneliness, reaching across the divide. "Eleanor, Ada, welcome." Silas helped them down from the wagon with easy courtesy. "I'm so glad you could come. Let me show you around." He gave them a tour of the property, and Eleanor found herself impressed by how much Silas knew about every aspect of his operation. He introduced them to his foreman, Jack Riley, a weathered man in his 50s who nodded respectfully but assessed Eleanor with sharp eyes. They met several of the ranch hands, saw the breeding stock Silas was particularly proud of, and walked through the barns where everything was organized with military precision. "Thomas would have loved this," Eleanor said as they stood in the main barn, breathing in the scent of hay and horses. "He always dreamed of running cattle on a larger scale. Our 40 acres wasn't enough for a real herd." 40 acres is nothing to dismiss," Silas said gently. "Some of the best ranchers I know started with less. It's not the size of the spread that matters, it's what you do with it. Still, this is—" Eleanor gestured at the barn, the corrals, the vast property beyond. "This is impressive, Silas." He looked uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just a ranch, bigger than some, smaller than others. Catherine and I built it together over 20 years. She had as much to do with its success as I did, maybe more. She kept the books, managed the household staff, dealt with the cattle buyers when I was out on range. I was just the muscle. She was the brains." The affection in his voice when he spoke of Catherine was clear, but Eleanor noticed something else too. There was no pain in it anymore, just warmth and appreciation for a life they'd shared. "Tell me about her," Eleanor said. "If you don't mind." They'd moved inside the house by then, into a spacious kitchen that showed signs of a woman's absence. The stove was clean, but the curtains were dusty. The dishes were functional but mismatched, as if Silas had been replacing broken ones haphazardly over the years. A lone coffee cup sat by the sink, the only evidence that anyone lived here at all. Silas pulled out a leather-bound book from a shelf near the window. This was Catherine's recipe book. Everything she knew about cooking, and she knew quite a bit, is in here. Her handwriting, her notes, Sometimes I open it just to see her words on the page." He handed it to Eleanor, and she opened it carefully. The pages were filled with neat script, recipes for everything from basic bread to elaborate holiday cakes. In the margins, Catherine had made notes. "Silas likes extra cinnamon. Double this for the hands. Christmas favorite." Each notation was a small window into their life together. "She sounds wonderful," Eleanor said, tracing a finger over one of the annotations. "She was. Practical and funny and patient with me when I didn't deserve it." Silas took the book back gently. "She got sick the winter of '82, just a fever or so we thought. But it wouldn't break, and she got weaker, and then one morning she didn't wake up. The doctor said it was pneumonia, but I think she was just tired. We'd been working so hard to build this place. Maybe she just needed to rest." Eleanor heard the guilt beneath his words, the what-ifs that haunted him. She knew that territory well. "Thomas died instantly," she said. "Fell from the barn roof, broke his neck. They said he wouldn't have felt anything. But I've always wondered, in that moment when he was falling, was he scared? Did he think of us? Or was it just nothing, and then it was over?" I think about that with Catherine, too. Her last conscious moments. Was she in pain? Was she frightened? I was sleeping next to her and I didn't know. Didn't wake up. Just slept through her dying. They stood in the kitchen, bound by shared guilt and shared loss. Ada had wandered into the parlor, giving them privacy for this conversation that needed to happen. "We can't know," Eleanor said finally. "We'll drive ourselves mad trying to. All we can do is honor them by living well. By not wasting the time they didn't get. Is that what we're doing?" Silas asked quietly. "Living well? I'm trying to. For the first time in 3 years, I'm actually trying." Silas smiled, and it transformed his face. "So am I." He insisted on cooking dinner himself. His house staff had Sundays off, he explained. Eleanor offered to help, and together they prepared a simple meal of roasted chicken, potatoes, and early greens from the ranch garden. The act of cooking side by side felt natural, their movements coordinating without discussion. When Eleanor reached for the salt, Silas was already handing it to her. When he needed the carving knife, she'd already placed it within reach. It was a small thing, this domestic harmony, but it spoke to something deeper, a compatibility that went beyond attraction or loneliness, an ease with each other that surprised them both. They ate at the big kitchen table, the three of them, and conversation flowed easily. Ada asked Silas about ranching, and he answered her questions with genuine interest in teaching. He asked about her plans to teach in Helena and listened carefully to her dreams and nervousness about the future. He treated her not as a child to be humored, but as a young woman with valid thoughts and ambitions. Eleanor watched the interaction and felt something settle in her chest. A good man, she thought. A kind man. The kind who would treat her daughter with respect. Who would welcome her children into his life if it came to that. Who would never try to replace their father, but might become something else. A friend, a mentor, a steadying presence. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley. The sky turned gold and orange and deep purple, and cattle lowed in the distance, and somewhere a nighthawk called. Ada had curled up in a chair with the book she'd found on Silas's shelf, leaving Eleanor and Silas to sit side by side on the porch swing. "This house feels empty most days," Silas said quietly. "Too big for one person, too full of silence. But today, with you here, with Ada's laughter, with conversation over dinner, it felt like a home again. My house is the opposite. Too small, too full of memories. I can't move without bumping into the past. Maybe that's what we need. Balance, your memories and my space. Your roots and my resources. He paused, searching for words. Your light. You bring light, Eleanor. I didn't realize how dark I'd been living until I saw it." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I don't feel very light. Then maybe we're reflecting each other. Maybe that's what this is. Two people holding up a mirror, showing each other what's still possible." The swing creaked gently as they moved, and Eleanor let herself lean slightly into Silas's shoulder. He didn't pull away, didn't push for more. Just accepted the small intimacy with quiet gratitude. "I'm glad you asked me to pretend," Eleanor said. That night at the supper, I'm glad you took the risk. So am I. Though I'll admit I almost didn't. Stood there for 10 minutes watching you, trying to find the courage. Figured the worst you could do was say no. But that felt like the end of the world at the time. I'm glad you did it anyway. Me too. They sat until the stars came out. Until Ada yawned and announced she was exhausted. Until Eleanor knew they needed to head home before it got too dark to see the road. Silas walked them to their wagon, helped them both up to the seat, and stepped back with obvious reluctance. "May I call on you again?" he asked. "Soon?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Please." She drove home in the gathering darkness, Ada dozing against her shoulder, and allowed herself to feel something she'd thought was gone forever, anticipation for tomorrow. 2 weeks passed in a pattern that began to feel like courtship, real courtship, not pretense. Silas came to dinner twice more, helped Eleanor repair the fence line that had been sagging for months, and brought small gifts that showed he was paying attention. A book of poems he thought she'd enjoy, seeds for her garden, a new coffee grinder to replace the one that had broken the previous winter. Eleanor found herself thinking about him at odd moments, while feeding the chickens, while kneading bread, while lying awake at night in her too-empty bed. She thought about his quiet competence, his gentle humor, the way he listened when she talked instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. She thought about how his presence made her feel less alone without making her feel crowded, but beneath the growing affection, guilt churned like a slow poison. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. Eleanor had gone to the barn to check on the milk cow, old Bessie, who Thomas had bought 8 years ago and who was now producing less each season, but whom Eleanor couldn't bring herself to sell. The barn was dim and dusty, filled with shadows and the scent of hay and animals. Eleanor had been in here 1,000 times since Thomas's death, but she usually moved quickly, completed her tasks, and left. The barn held too many memories, too much of Thomas's presence. Today, though, something made her pause. Maybe it was the slant of afternoon light through the gaps in the roof boards, the same light that had been falling that day 3 years ago. Maybe it was the creaking of the old wood in the wind. Whatever it was, Eleanor found herself standing very still, remembering. Thomas had been whistling. She'd heard him from the house, that tuneless whistle he did when he was working, concentrating. He'd been replacing shingles, preparing for winter. Then the whistling had stopped, and there'd been a terrible crash, and when she'd run outside, Eleanor shook her head, pushing the memory away. She couldn't go there. Not now, not when she was finally learning to think about tomorrow instead of yesterday. She moved toward Bessie's stall, and that's when she saw them. Thomas's work gloves, hanging on a nail beside the stall door. She'd forgotten they were there, must have hung them up herself right after his death, unable to throw them away, but unable to look at them either. Now they hung in the dusty light, leather stiff and cracked from 3 years of neglect, the fingers curled as if still shaped to Thomas's hands. Eleanor reached out and lifted them from the nail. They were heavy, solid, real. Thomas had worn these gloves every day. They'd shaped themselves to his grip, bore the marks of his work, the calluses worn into the leather matching the calluses that had roughened his palms. She could remember those hands, strong and careful, capable of gentleness despite their roughness. Hands that had built this barn, this house, this life. Hands she'd held for 22 years. The tears came suddenly, violently, 3 years of suppressed grief rising up all at once. Eleanor sank down onto a hay bale, clutching the gloves to her chest, and let herself break. She'd been so strong, so practical. She'd kept the homestead running, raised the children, maintained her dignity. She'd survived. But surviving meant pushing down the pain, boxing it up, pretending she could function if she just didn't look directly at what she'd lost. Now, holding Thomas's gloves, she looked, and it was unbearable. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty barn. "Thomas, I'm so sorry." Sorry for what? For letting another man into her life? For smiling at Silas's jokes? For feeling something other than grief when she thought about the future? Or was she sorry for something deeper, for being alive when Thomas wasn't, for having the audacity to want happiness again, for forgetting him even for a moment? "Mama," Eleanor looked up, hastily, wiping her eyes. Ada stood in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon light. "Mama, what's wrong?" Eleanor tried to answer, but couldn't find her voice. Ada crossed to her quickly, kneeling in front of her mother, her young face full of concern. "What is it? Are you hurt?" Eleanor shook her head and held up the gloves. Ada's expression shifted, understanding flooding her features. "Oh, Mama." "I can't do this," Eleanor said, the words tumbling out. "I can't. Ada, I can't betray him like this. He was my husband. I loved him. How can I? You're not betraying anyone," Ada said firmly, taking her mother's hands. "Papa's gone, Mama. He's been gone 3 years. You mourning forever won't bring him back, but I feel like I'm forgetting him. Every time Silas comes over, every time I laugh at something he says, every time I think about him instead of your father, it feels like I'm erasing Thomas, bit by bit. That's not how memory works." Ada squeezed her mother's hands. "Loving Mr. Boone, if that's what this is becoming, doesn't erase loving Papa. You can hold both. People aren't like spaces that can only be filled by one person at a time. Your heart is big enough for both." "How can you be so sure? You're 17. I'm 17 and I'm not an idiot." Ada's voice was gentle but insistent. "Mama, I've watched you these past 3 years. Watched you disappear into grief and duty and just existing. You stopped living. And I've been so worried because I'm leaving in August, and you'll be alone, truly alone. And I've been terrified of what that would do to you. But then Mr. Boone came along, and for the first time in years, I saw my mother come back. The woman who used to sing while she cooked, who used to laugh at Papa's terrible jokes, who used to look at tomorrow like it might hold something good." Eleanor wiped her eyes, unable to meet her daughter's gaze. "It feels wrong." "Why?" "Because you think Papa would want you to be miserable for the rest of your life." Ada stood and began pacing, her voice rising with frustration. "Papa loved you, Mama, really loved you. And because he loved you, he'd want you to be happy. He'd want you to have help with this homestead. He'd want you to have companionship and joy and all the things he can't give you anymore because he's gone. You don't know that? I do know that. I remember Papa. I remember how he looked at you, how he talked about you when you weren't around. He was proud to be your husband. He knew how lucky he was. And Mama, if he could see you now, see you finally beginning to live again, he'd be glad. Not hurt, not betrayed, glad." Eleanor wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down, beneath the guilt and grief, she knew Ada was right. Thomas had been a practical man, a man who dealt with reality as it was rather than as he wished it to be. He'd never been one for grand romantic gestures or flowery declarations, but he'd loved her in his steady, dependable way. And that same practical nature would have wanted her cared for after he was gone. "I miss him," Eleanor said quietly. "I miss him so much, and I'm terrified that if I let myself love Silas, I'll forget what it felt like to love your father." "You won't forget. How could you? You have 3 children who are living proof of that love. You have this homestead built with his hands. You have 22 years of memories. None of that goes away just because you're building something new." Ada sat back down beside her mother, resting her head on Eleanor's shoulder the way she used to when she was small. "I have something to tell you," Ada said quietly. "I was waiting for the right time, but maybe now is it." Eleanor's stomach tightened with fresh worry. "What is it?" "I've been accepted to the normal school in Helena. Classes start in August. They've offered me a place in the dormitory and a small stipend for books. It's everything I applied for." Eleanor had known this was coming, had encouraged it even, but hearing the words made it real in a way that felt like another loss. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you, but it means you'll be alone here. Really alone, And Mama, I can't leave if I think you're going to spend the next 2 years or the rest of your life hiding out here, grieving. I need to know you're going to be all right. You can't stay here for my sake. I'm not saying I'll stay. I'm saying I need to know you're living, not just existing. And Mr. Boone, Mama, he's good for you. I can see it. The way you light up when he's around. The way you actually care about how you look again. How you've started wearing colors instead of just gray and brown. The way you smile. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her daughter's concern and the responsibility it implied. Ada was asking for permission. Permission to leave. Permission to live her own life. Permission to stop worrying about her mother. And the only way to give her that was to accept what Ada was saying, that it was time to stop grieving and start living. All right, Eleanor said quietly. You're right. I know you're right. I'm just scared. Of what? Of everything. Of being hurt again. Of dishonoring your father. Of making a mistake. Of Eleanor paused, searching for the deepest truth. Of hoping for something and having it taken away. Because that's what life does, Ada. It gives you 22 good years and then it takes them away in an instant. Why would I open myself up to that kind of pain again? Because the alternative is worse, Ada said simply. Living safe but lonely, protected but empty, Mama, that's not living at all. That's just waiting to die. The harsh words hung in the air, but Eleanor couldn't deny their truth. That's exactly what she'd been doing, waiting, existing, marking time. What do I do with these? Eleanor held up Thomas's gloves again. Ada took them gently from her mother's hands and stood. She walked to the barn door and found an old wooden box on a shelf, one Thomas had used for storing small tools. She placed the gloves inside carefully. There, keep them, Ada said, but you don't carry them around. You honor Papa's memory, but you don't let it trap you. You remember the past, but you live in the present. Eleanor nodded, understanding the symbolism. The gloves were stored but not destroyed, remembered but not constantly before her eyes. Like her grief, like Thomas himself, always a part of her, but no longer defining her entirely. They walked back to the house together, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her. Not the erasure of grief or the abandonment of memory, but a subtle reorientation. The past was important, but it wasn't everything. Thomas had been her husband, her partner, the father of her children. But he was gone, and she was still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling joy. She could love Thomas's memory and still open her heart to Silas. She could honor what she'd lost and still embrace what she might gain. She could be both widow and woman, both grieving and hopeful, both ended and beginning. That evening, when Silas came by as he'd promised, with a broken wagon wheel that needed welding, another excuse that fooled no one, Eleanor greeted him with a warmth she'd been holding back. And when he left, she stood on the porch watching until he disappeared from view. Thomas's ring still on a chain around her neck, but her heart, for the first time in 3 years, beginning to open. The surveyor arrived on a Thursday morning, a thin man in city clothes who looked entirely out of place on the Montana prairie. He carried a leather satchel and an air of importance, and he'd come looking for Eleanor Briggs regarding a matter of significant financial interest. Or so he claimed. Eleanor met him at the door, Ada standing protectively behind her. They'd learned to be cautious with strangers. Too many had come west with promises that turned out to be schemes. Mrs. Briggs, my name is Harold Pemberton. I represent the Northern Montana Railroad Company. He handed her a card, printed with fancy lettering. We're expanding our line westward, and your property sits directly in the proposed right-of-way. I'm here to discuss fair compensation for an easement across your land. Eleanor stared at him, trying to process the words. Railroad? Her 40 acres? It seemed impossible. There must be some mistake. My homestead is nowhere near the current rail line. Not the current line, no. But the expansion will run through this valley, connecting to the mining operations up north. Your property and several others in the area are directly in the path. He pulled out a rolled map from his satchel. May I show you? They moved to the kitchen table, and Pemberton spread out the survey map, anchoring the corners with coffee cups. Eleanor leaned over it, trying to make sense of the lines and notations. Sure enough, a thick red line cut straight across what appeared to be her property, continuing on to, "That's the Rocking Bee," she said, pointing to the adjacent markings. "Silas Boone's ranch. Indeed, Mr. Boone's property is also affected. In fact, the railroad will be approaching him with a similar offer. But your parcel, Mrs. Briggs, is critical to the route. Without access through your land, the entire expansion could be delayed or rerouted at significant cost, which meant, Eleanor realized with a sinking feeling, that her small homestead suddenly had value far beyond its agricultural worth. The railroad needed her land, and they'd pay handsomely for it. "How much are we talking about?" Ada asked, always more practical than her mother. Pemberton named a figure that made Eleanor's breath catch. It was more money than Thomas had made in 5 years of hard work, more money than she'd ever imagined having at once. With that sum, she could pay off every debt, establish trust funds for her children, maybe even buy a small house in town where she wouldn't have to work herself to exhaustion just to survive. But it was also Thomas's land, the place they'd built together, the home where they'd raised their children, 40 acres that represented every dream and sacrifice they'd made. "I need time to think about this," Eleanor said. Pemberton nodded, gathering up his map. "Of course. The railroad is prepared to be generous, Mrs. Briggs, but we do need a decision within the next few weeks. Other routes are being considered, and if we can't secure this one quickly, we'll be forced to move forward with alternatives." After he left, Eleanor sat at the table, staring at the spot where the map had been. Ada poured them both coffee and sat down across from her mother. "That's a lot of money, Mama." "It is. Enough to change everything, to make life easier, to give you choices you don't have now." "I know." Ada hesitated, then said quietly, "You could move to Helena with me. Buy a little house near the normal school. Start fresh somewhere that doesn't hurt so much." Eleanor looked at her daughter, seeing both hope and guilt in her expression. Ada wanted her mother cared for, wanted to stop worrying, but she didn't want to ask her mother to give up Thomas's dream. "Let me think about it," Eleanor said. This is too big a decision to make quickly, but she already knew what she needed to do. She needed to talk to Silas. If the railroad was approaching him too, they should discuss this together. Their properties were connected by more than just geography now. She rode to the Rocking Bee that afternoon, following the road she'd come to know well over the past weeks. The ranch hands recognized her now, waving as she passed, and Jack Riley, the foreman, directed her to where Silas was working with some horses in the North Corral. Silas looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a smile that faded quickly when he saw her expression. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" She explained about Pemberton's visit, about the railroad survey, about the offer for her land. Silas listened with growing concern, his jaw tightening. "He came here yesterday," Silas said. "I told him I'd need time to consider, but Eleanor, I had no idea your property was involved too. If I'd known, what would you have done differently? I would have come to you immediately. We should have discussed this together." They walked back to the ranch house, and Silas retrieved his own copy of the survey map. They spread it out on his kitchen table, and Eleanor could see clearly now how the proposed route cut through both properties, linking them in a way that made individual decisions impossible. What one of them decided would affect the other. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor asked. "I don't know. The money would be significant, but I don't need it. The ranch is profitable. I've got more land than I can effectively use as it is. Losing a few hundred acres to a railroad easement wouldn't hurt me much." He paused, looking at her carefully. "But you, Eleanor, this money could change your life. I know. You could stop struggling. Stop working yourself to exhaustion. You could have security, options, a future that doesn't involve fighting to keep a homestead running alone." "I know," she said again, quieter this time. Silas was silent for a long moment, studying the map. Then he said, "I have a proposition. It's going to sound calculated, and I want you to know that's not my intention. But I've been thinking about it since Pemberton left yesterday, and I can't see another solution that makes sense. What is it? You could sell your property to me. I'd pay you fair value, manage it properly, and the railroad deal would be simpler with consolidated ownership. Or, he stopped, took a breath, seemed to gather courage. Or you could consider merging our properties through marriage. It would solve the railroad situation, secure your future, and marriage. Eleanor's voice came out sharper than she intended. You're proposing marriage as a business arrangement? No, that's not. Eleanor, I'm doing this badly. Silas ran his hand through his hair, frustration evident. I care about you. These past weeks have meant more to me than I can say. But I also can't ignore the practical reality. You need help. I can provide it. Marriage would solve multiple problems at once. Eleanor stood, feeling like she'd been slapped. Multiple problems. How romantic. That's not what I meant, isn't it? Silas, I thought what we had was real. Not some practical arrangement to simplify railroad negotiations. It is real. I'm just trying to also be practical about the circumstances. Well, you've succeeded. Eleanor moved toward the door, her throat tight with hurt and anger. You've made it perfectly clear that this courtship has been about land and money and convenience. Thank you for your honesty. Eleanor, please. But she was already leaving, climbing back into her wagon, snapping the reins harder than necessary. As she drove away, she refused to look back, though she could feel Silas watching her go. The ride home was a blur of emotions she couldn't sort. Hurt, certainly, anger, betrayal, but underneath all of that, a deeper pain, disappointment. She'd let herself hope, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have something real again. Someone who wanted her, not for what she could provide, but for who she was. And instead, it had all been about property and profit and practical solutions to inconvenient problems. By the time she reached her homestead, Eleanor's eyes were dry, but her heart felt bruised. Ada was waiting on the porch, and one look at her mother's face told her something had gone wrong. Mama, what happened? Nothing, Eleanor said, climbing down from the wagon. Nothing happened. Mr. Boone made me a very practical business proposal and I declined. That's all. I don't understand. He wants to marry me, Ada. Not because he loves me, but because it would make the railroad deal simpler. Because combining our properties makes economic sense. Because I'm a problem he can solve with a wedding. She brushed past her daughter and went inside, needing to be alone with her humiliation. How could she have been so foolish? How could she have mistaken convenience for affection, practical arrangement for genuine care? That night, lying in bed, Eleanor removed the chain from around her neck and looked at Thomas's ring. She'd been ready to take it off, ready to move it from around her neck to a box with his gloves, ready to make space for someone new, but she'd been wrong. There was no one new. Just another man seeing her as a means to an end, a practical solution to a business complication. She put the chain back on, feeling the familiar weight of the ring against her chest. At least Thomas had wanted her for herself. At least their marriage, however practical it had been at times, had been built on genuine affection and partnership. She wouldn't make the mistake of hoping for that again. Hope, she was learning, was more dangerous than grief. Grief at least was honest. Hope lied to you, made you believe in possibilities that didn't exist, set you up for a fall that hurt worse than staying down in the first place. Tomorrow, she'd contact Mr. Pemberton and discuss the railroad offer. She'd make her decision based on practical considerations, just like Silas had suggested. No emotions, no foolish hopes, just business. It was, after all, the sensible thing to do. Outside, the Montana night was cold and dark, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled its loneliness to the uncaring stars. Eleanor listened and understood completely. Some things were meant to remain alone. Some losses couldn't be replaced, no matter how much you wanted them to be. She pulled the blankets tight and tried not to think about Silas's face when she'd left, about the regret in his eyes that she'd been too hurt to acknowledge. Tried not to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she'd misunderstood. Tried not to care. She failed at all of it, and dawn found her sleepless, hollow, and more alone than she'd been the night Thomas died. Eleanor spent the next 3 days in a fog of hurt and determination. She drafted a letter to Mr. Pemberton stating she was willing to discuss the railroad offer. She avoided going to town, knowing she'd likely see Silas at church or the mercantile. She threw herself into work, mending, cleaning, organizing, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from circling back to that conversation in Silas's kitchen. Ada watched her mother with worried eyes but said nothing, sensing that whatever had broken between Eleanor and Silas needed time to either heal or finish breaking completely. On Sunday, Eleanor stayed home from church for the first time in years, claiming a headache. It wasn't entirely a lie. Her head did ache, from crying herself to sleep and from the constant tension of trying not to think about Silas. Ada went alone, and Eleanor spent the morning in furious activity, scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, beating rugs that were already clean. The mail came Monday afternoon, delivered by young Tom Chen, who rode out from his father's mercantile twice a week with parcels and letters for the outlying homesteads. There were 2 letters for Eleanor, one from Samuel, brief as always, saying he was well and heading north with another herd. The other was from Margaret, thicker and sealed with the careful attention to detail that was her eldest daughter's nature. Eleanor made coffee and settled at the kitchen table to read. Margaret's letters were always long, full of news about the children, about William's store, about life in Billings. Eleanor treasured them, these glimpses into her daughter's world, even as they reminded her of how far away Margaret had gone. The first page was typical. The children were well. William had hired a new clerk. Margaret's pregnancy was progressing smoothly. But the second page began with words that made Eleanor's breath catch. "Mother, I hope you won't be angry with me for keeping this from you, but I felt you should know now, given what Ada has written about Mr. Boone's attentions to you." Eleanor's hand tightened on the paper. "Last spring, before Father had been gone even a year, Mr. Boone came to Billings. I didn't know him well then, had only seen him at church and town gatherings, but he sought me out at the mercantile where I was shopping. He asked if he might speak with me privately, and I agreed, though I was curious and a bit concerned about what he might want. We went to the hotel dining room, and Mother, he was so careful, so respectful. He said he hoped I wouldn't think him presumptuous, but he'd noticed that you seemed to be struggling. He'd seen you at church, at town gatherings, and he was concerned about whether you were managing the homestead alone. He asked, very gently, if you needed help, if there were debts or difficulties, if there was anything he could do without making you feel pitied or patronized. I was so taken aback. Here was this wealthy rancher, practically a stranger, expressing genuine concern for my mother's welfare. I told him you were proud and wouldn't accept charity, that you'd rather struggle alone than feel indebted to anyone. He nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Then he said something I'll never forget. Your mother shouldn't have to struggle alone. Your father was a good man who left her a good legacy, but 40 acres isn't enough for one person to manage. If there are ever emergencies, if she ever needs help and won't ask for it, will you let me know? I'd consider it an honor to assist in whatever way she'd allow." He gave me his address and left. He didn't ask for anything in return, didn't suggest any arrangement or expectation, just offered help if it was ever needed. "Mother, I didn't tell you because I knew you'd be mortified, knew you'd feel like people were pitying you, talking about you. But he wasn't pitying you. He was, I don't know how to explain it, but there was something in the way he spoke about you, with respect, with admiration for your strength, and maybe even then, with a tenderness he wasn't quite acknowledging even to himself. I've thought about that conversation many times since, and now, reading Ada's letters about how he's courting you, about the prairie supper and his visits and the pressed flour, Mother, I don't think any of it was coincidence. I think he's been watching over you for over a year, caring about you from a distance, waiting for the right moment to approach you properly. Whatever happened between you recently that has you doubting his intentions, please consider this. A man who would seek out your daughter in secret just to ensure you were cared for. A man who would spend a year quietly watching and waiting for the right time. That's not a man motivated by business convenience. That's a man who cares deeply, even if he's terrible at expressing it. I hope this doesn't upset you. I just felt you should know. You deserve to know that someone has been thinking of you, caring about you, long before he had any reason to hope you might return his affection." Eleanor set down the letter with shaking hands. She read it again, and then a third time, each word rearranging her understanding of everything that had happened over the past months. Silas had been looking out for her for over a year. Before the prairie supper, before the pretense, before he'd had any reason to think she might welcome his attention. He'd gone to Margaret, travelled all the way to Billings, just to quietly check on Eleanor's well-being, the pressed flower, the broken tools that needed fixing, the way he always seemed to appear when she needed help most. None of it had been coincidence. He'd been caring for her from the shadows, protecting her pride while ensuring she wasn't completely alone. And his proposal, that clumsy, terrible proposal about practical arrangements and solving problems, suddenly made horrifying sense. He'd been trying to offer her security without making her feel like charity. He'd been trying to give her a dignified reason to accept help, even if it meant making himself sound calculating and cold. He'd been willing to let her think the worst of him if it meant she'd be taken care of. "Oh no," Eleanor whispered. "Oh, Silas, no." Ada came in from the garden, took one look at her mother's face, and hurried over. "Mama, what's wrong?" Eleanor handed her Margaret's letter without a word. Ada read it, her eyes widening, and then she looked at her mother with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and exasperation. "Mama, what did you do?" "I thought," he made it sound like business, like I was a problem to be solved. "Because he's a man, Mama, a good man, but still a man. They're terrible at saying what they actually mean when it matters most." Eleanor stood pacing the kitchen, her mind racing. "I have to apologize. I have to tell him I understand now." "Do you understand? Really?" Ada's voice was gentle but firm. "Because if you go to him now, you need to be sure. He's put his heart on the line, Mama. Clumsy as it was, that proposal was him trying to take care of you the only way he knew how. If you reject him again, I won't. Ada, I won't. I was angry and hurt and I didn't let him explain, but I understand now. He was trying to protect me, even from himself." Eleanor went to her room and pulled out the small jewelry box where she kept her few precious things. Thomas's ring on its chain, a brooch from her mother, a lock of baby hair from each of her children, and now, carefully pressed between 2 pages of her Bible, the wildflower Silas had left her that first morning. She took out the flower and held it up to the light. Montana bitterroot, hardy, resilient, beautiful in its simplicity. It bloomed in harsh conditions, in rocky soil, surviving where other flowers couldn't. Silas had chosen it deliberately, she realized now. Not just any wildflower, but this one specifically. A flower that represented survival and strength and the ability to bloom despite adversity. He'd been telling her something with that flower, telling her he saw her strength, admired it, and wanted to be part of helping her not just survive, but bloom. And she'd thrown it back in his face with her hurt and suspicion. Eleanor made her decision. She'd go to him tomorrow, first thing. She'd apologize for not listening, for not giving him a chance to explain. She'd tell him she understood now, that she saw what he'd been trying to do, even if he'd done it badly. But fate, as it often did, had other plans. That evening, as Eleanor was preparing dinner and trying to rehearse what she'd say to Silas, they heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Ada looked out the window and her face went pale. "Mama, it's Jack Riley from the Rocking Bee, and he looks worried." Eleanor's heart seized. She ran to the door just as Silas's foreman was dismounting. Jack Riley was a man who never showed emotion, but his face was grim now. "Mrs. Briggs, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's trouble. The railroad sent men out today to start surveying. Mr. Boone told them to get off his property until contracts were signed. Things got heated. One of their men pulled a gun and..." He paused, and Eleanor felt the world tilt. "Mr. Boone's been shot." The words didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. Shot. Silas had been shot. Is he... Eleanor couldn't finish the question. "He's alive. Doc Harrison's with him now at the ranch. But Mrs. Briggs, he's been asking for you." Kept saying your name, saying he needed to explain, needed to make you understand something. I don't know what happened between you two, but he's pretty insistent about seeing you. Eleanor didn't remember moving, didn't remember telling Ada to stay home, didn't remember climbing onto her wagon, didn't remember the ride to the rocking bee. All she knew was that Silas was hurt, possibly dying, and the last words she'd said to him had been angry and cruel. The ranch yard was chaos when she arrived, ranch hands standing in worried clusters, the doctor's buggy near the house, lamps lit in every window. Jack Riley helped her down and led her inside, up the stairs to Silas's bedroom. Dr. Harrison met her at the door, his expression grave, but not hopeless. He's stable for now. Bullet went through his shoulder, missed anything vital, lost a lot of blood, but I've seen men survive worse. Main thing now is preventing infection and keeping him calm. He's been agitated, asking for you. The doctor stepped aside. Don't tire him out, but if seeing you settles him, that might be the best medicine right now. Eleanor entered the room and saw Silas lying in the big bed, his shoulder wrapped in bandages, his face pale and drawn with pain. But his eyes were open, and when he saw her, something like relief flooded his features. "Eleanor," he breathed. "You came." She crossed to him quickly, taking his hand in both of hers. "Of course I came. Silas, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't listen, sorry I walked away." "No." His grip tightened on her hand. "I'm sorry. I made it sound like business when it was never about that. Eleanor, I've cared about you for so long. Watched you from a distance, wanted to help but didn't know how without insulting your pride. That night at the prairie supper, asking you to pretend, it was just an excuse to finally talk to you, to be near you, to see if maybe, just maybe, you might feel something for me too." "I do," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "Silas, I do feel something for you. I have for weeks now. I was just frightened. And when you mentioned marriage in the same breath as the railroad, I thought, I know what you thought, and I don't blame you. I handled it terribly. Eleanor, listen to me." He pulled her closer, his voice urgent despite his weakness. "The railroad doesn't matter. The land doesn't matter. Sell it, keep it, do whatever you want. All that matters is you, having you in my life. Not because it's practical or convenient, but because when I'm with you, I feel less alone. Because your smile is the best thing I've seen in 5 years. Because I think I'm falling in love with you, and that terrifies me and thrills me in equal measure." Eleanor laid her head carefully on the bed beside him, holding his hand against her cheek. "I'm falling in love with you too, and it does terrify me. But Silas, I don't want to be afraid anymore. I want to be brave enough to try. Brave enough to hope. Brave enough to believe that we both deserve a second chance. Is that a yes?" He managed a weak smile. "Because I should probably warn you, this is the second time I've proposed, and I seem to be terrible at it. If you turn me down again, my pride might not survive." Eleanor laughed through her tears. Yes, it's a yes. Not because of land or railroads or practical arrangements. Just because I want to. Because you make me laugh. Because you see me, really see me, and you care anyway. Because I'm tired of being alone when I could be with you." Silas closed his eyes, and for a moment Eleanor panicked, thinking he was slipping away. But then he squeezed her hand and whispered, "Thank God. I was running out of excuses to come by your homestead with broken tools, and despite everything, the gunshot, the fear, the chaos of the day," Eleanor found herself smiling. Silas's recovery was slower than either of them liked, but faster than Dr. Harrison had dared hope. The bullet wound healed cleanly, without infection, and within a week Silas was sitting up in bed, complaining about being confined to his room. Within 2 weeks, he was moving around the house, his arm in a sling, but his spirits improving daily. Eleanor spent those 2 weeks at the Rocking Bee, much to the delight of the ranch hands and the complete lack of surprise from anyone who knew them. Ada came too, helping to nurse Silas and keep house while Eleanor tended to the patient. It was a strange, suspended time. Not quite courtship, not quite marriage, but something in between. A preview of what their life together might look like. And Eleanor found, somewhat to her surprise, that she liked it. Liked waking up in the big house with Silas down the hall. Liked cooking meals in a kitchen that had proper space and good equipment. Liked the sound of voices and activity, the ranch hands coming and going, the sense of purpose and community that permeated the rocking bee. After 3 years of silence and solitude, it felt like coming back to life. "You're smiling," Silas observed one afternoon as she brought him tea. He was sitting in a chair by the window, watching the ranch activity below. Dr. Harrison had finally cleared him to leave his bedroom, though he was still forbidden from any strenuous activity. "Am I?" Eleanor set the tea on the table beside him and settled into the other chair. "You've been smiling a lot lately. It's a good look on you. Maybe I have reason to smile. Good reasons or terrible reasons. Because accepting a marriage proposal from a man who got himself shot has to fall somewhere on the terrible end of the scale." Eleanor reached for his hand, the one not immobilized by the sling. "The best reason. I'm happy, Silas. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm actually happy." His expression softened. "So am I, though I could do without the hole in my shoulder. The railroad men have been dealt with, I hear. Sheriff arrested the one who shot me. Turned out he wasn't even with the railroad, just a hired thug trying to intimidate property owners into selling cheap. The actual railroad company has apologized profusely and offered compensation. I told them to direct any compensation to you. Silas, your land, your decision. I meant what I said, Eleanor. This marriage isn't about property or business. Whatever you decide to do with your homestead is entirely up to you." Eleanor had been thinking about that. The railroad offer was still substantial, still tempting. But she'd realized something during these weeks at the Rocking Bee. She didn't want to sell Thomas's land. She wanted to honor it, preserve it, maybe even make it productive again. And married to Silas, she'd have the resources to do that. "I want to keep it," she said. "The homestead. I thought about selling, but it's where I raised my children, where Thomas and I built our life. I don't want to give that up. I just want to stop struggling with it alone. Then we'll keep it. Hire someone to manage it or merge it into the Rocking Bee's operations. Whatever makes sense. Eleanor, you'll never have to struggle alone again. That's what marriage means. Sharing the burden, sharing the joy, sharing everything." The words were so simple, so direct, but they carried a weight of promise that made Eleanor's throat tighten. This was what she'd been afraid of. This vulnerability, this dependence, this opening of her heart to someone who could hurt her. But sitting here with Silas, his hand warm in hers, she realized the fear had lessened. Not disappeared, she didn't think it ever would entirely, but softened into something manageable. "We should set a date," Silas said, "for the wedding. Before I lose my nerve, or you come to your senses." "I've already come to my senses. That's why I'm here. Then let's make it official, soon. I don't want to wait months for some elaborate ceremony. Just simple. Us, a preacher, and anyone who wants to witness." Eleanor thought of Ada leaving for Helena in August. Thought of how little time they had left together. A month from now. That gives Ada time to help with preparations before she goes. Gives you time to heal properly. And gives the town enough notice that they can't complain about being left out. "A month," Silas nodded. "I can wait a month. Barely." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light shift across the valley. Eleanor found herself thinking about Thomas, wondering what he'd make of all this. Would he approve? Would he think she'd moved on too quickly, or would he be relieved that she'd found someone to care for her? She'd never know, but she chose to believe he'd be glad. Thomas had been practical above all else, and he'd never wanted her to suffer unnecessarily. This marriage to Silas was practical, combining resources, securing her future, ensuring she wouldn't face old age alone. But it was also more than that. It was hope. It was joy. It was the chance to build something new without forgetting what had come before. "There's something I need to do," Eleanor said, standing. "Before the wedding, something important." "What's that?" "I need to take Thomas's ring off. Really take it off, not just move it to a drawer. Say goodbye properly. And I need to do it alone." Silas understood immediately. "Of course, whatever you need." The next morning, Eleanor rode back to her homestead. It was the first time she'd been there in over 2 weeks, and the place looked different somehow, smaller, more fragile. The fence still needed mending. The garden was overgrown. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. All the repairs she'd been putting off, all the work that had overwhelmed her, seemed more obvious in her absence. But it also looked like home, like a place where love had lived, where children had grown, where good memories outnumbered bad. Not a prison of grief, as it had felt for so long, but a monument to resilience and survival. Ada was there, sweeping the porch. She looked up as her mother approached and set aside the broom. "How's Mr. Boone?" "Better. Strong enough to be annoying about being confined." Eleanor smiled. "We've set a date, 4 weeks from Saturday. Before you leave for Helena." Ada's face lit up. "Really, Mama? That's wonderful. A month, that's enough time to plan something nice without being too rushed. Nothing elaborate. Just family and friends. Simple. Simple can still be beautiful." Ada took her mother's hands. "I'm so happy for you, Mama. You deserve this. You deserve to be loved and cared for and happy." Eleanor pulled her daughter into a hug, holding her tight. Soon Ada would leave for Helena, would start her own life, and these moments of closeness would become rare and precious. She needed to memorize this, the feel of her daughter's arms around her, the scent of her hair, the steady beat of her heart. "I need to go to the cemetery," Eleanor said when they pulled apart. "Will you come with me?" They rode together to the small plot on the hill where Thomas was buried, along with several other pioneers who'd tried to make a life in this harsh, beautiful land. Eleanor had been here dozens of times over the past 3 years, bringing flowers, pulling weeds, talking to a stone marker as if it could hear her. Today felt different. Final, in a way the other visits hadn't been. She knelt beside the grave, Ada standing a respectful distance away, and Eleanor reached under her collar to remove the chain that held Thomas's ring. She'd worn it every day since his death, the weight of it a constant reminder of what she'd lost. Now holding it in her palm, she felt the weight of what she was choosing, to let go, to move forward, to live. "I'm getting married," she said to the stone. To the earth, to whatever of Thomas might still hear her. To Silas Boone. He's a good man, kind and patient and strong. He makes me laugh. He makes me feel less alone. I think you'd like him. You'd respect him anyway, and for you that was always more important than liking. The wind blew across the hilltop, carrying the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers. A hawk circled overhead, hunting. "I'll always love you, Thomas. You were my husband, my partner, the father of my children. Nothing can change that. But I can't keep living in the past. I can't keep wearing your ring like a shield against the future. Our children are grown. Our life together is over. And I'm still here, still breathing, still capable of hope and joy and love." She dug a small hole beside the grave marker and placed the ring inside, covering it with earth. Not throwing it away, keeping it close to Thomas, where it belonged, but taking it off her neck, releasing herself from the weight of it. "I'm not forgetting you," she whispered. "I'm just moving forward. Finally, I hope you understand. I hope, wherever you are, you're at peace. And I hope you want that for me, too." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt, and turned to find Ada crying silently. Mother and daughter embraced, both grieving and celebrating, both saying goodbye and hello to different futures. The ride back to the homestead was quiet, contemplative. Eleanor felt lighter, as if she'd been carrying a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged, and had finally set it down. The guilt was still there. She suspected it always would be, in small measure, but it no longer controlled her. She could honor Thomas's memory and still build a life with Silas. She could love what she'd had and still hope for what might come. Over the next few weeks, preparations for the wedding consumed them all. Martha Hendricks took charge with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign. The church was reserved. Invitations were delivered. Food was organized. Ada worked on altering Catherine's wedding dress, the one Silas had offered, making it fit Eleanor perfectly. Silas's recovery continued, and by the 3rd week he was back to light ranch work, his shoulder still healing but functional. The bullet wound had left a scar, but as Silas observed with dry humor, it gave him something to show off and complain about in equal measure. Samuel arrived home a week before the wedding, taking leave from his cattle drive work to give away his mother. Margaret came from Billings with William and the children, filling the small homestead with noise and activity. The family gathered together for the first time since Thomas's funeral. But this time, there was joy instead of grief, anticipation instead of sorrow. The night before the wedding, Eleanor stood in her small homestead kitchen, surrounded by her children, and felt a complicated mix of emotions. Grief for what she'd lost, gratitude for what she'd survived, hope for what lay ahead. "You're sure about this?" Samuel asked, ever the protective son. "It's not too late to change your mind if you're having doubts." "I'm sure. More sure than I've been about anything in a long time." "He's a good man," Margaret said firmly. "I've thought so since that day he came to see me in Billings. A man who'd do that, who'd check on someone's welfare in secret, expecting nothing in return. That's a man worth marrying. Plus he's rich," Ada added, then laughed at her mother's expression. "I'm joking, Mama, mostly, but it doesn't hurt that you'll never have to worry about money again." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It doesn't hurt. But that's not why I'm marrying him. We know," her children said in unison, and Eleanor realized they did know. They understood that she was marrying for companionship and love, for the chance to not spend the rest of her life alone, for the simple human need to be seen and valued and cared for. She was marrying Silas Boone because he made her want to wake up in the morning, because he saw her as she was, flawed and frightened and still grieving in places, and wanted her anyway, because when she looked at the future, she couldn't imagine it without him in it. That was enough. More than enough. Tomorrow, she'd stand in the church where she'd married Thomas 24 years ago. She'd wear a dress that had belonged to another woman's great love. She'd speak vows that meant both the same and different things than they had the first time. And she'd become Eleanor Boone, a new name for a new beginning, while still carrying all the pieces of who she'd been before. The night was cool and clear, and Eleanor stepped outside onto her porch one last time as Eleanor Briggs. Tomorrow, everything would change. She was ready, more than ready. She was hopeful. And after 3 years of darkness, hope felt like the sun finally breaking through clouds. Morning arrived with sunlight streaming through the windows of Eleanor's homestead, where she'd spent her last night as a single woman. The house was full of activity. Margaret directing the children, Ada putting final touches on the dress, Martha arriving early with flowers and good wishes and a basket of food for after the ceremony. Eleanor sat at her vanity, the same one Thomas had built for her 20 years ago, and studied her reflection. 42 years old, with lines at her eyes and silver threading through her hair. Not the young bride who'd married Thomas, full of dreams and naivety. This time, she knew what marriage meant, the work of it, the compromise, the daily choosing to love even when it was difficult. But she also knew its rewards, partnership, companionship, the comfort of not facing life's challenges alone. "Mama, you're beautiful." Ada stood behind her, hands on her mother's shoulders. In the mirror, their eyes met, and Eleanor saw both pride and sadness in her daughter's expression. "You're leaving soon," Eleanor said quietly. 2 weeks, I am. But I'm leaving knowing you're cared for, Mama. That makes it easier. I don't have to worry about you being alone anymore. I would have been fine. I know you would have. But fine isn't the same as happy. And you deserve to be happy. Margaret appeared in the doorway, Eleanor's granddaughter balanced on her hip. "The dress is ready. Shall we?" The dress was beautiful. Catherine's wedding dress, altered to fit Eleanor's frame, but still carrying the grace and elegance of its original design. It was cream-colored silk with simple lines, modest lace at the collar and cuffs. When Eleanor put it on, she felt the weight of history, not just Catherine's history, but her own. 2 women who'd loved the same man, separated by years, but connected by the hope that marriage represented. "Silas gave me this," Eleanor said as Margaret fastened the buttons. "Catherine's dress. Do you think she'd mind?" "I think she'd be honored," Margaret said firmly. From what I've heard about her, she was a practical woman. She'd want the dress to be used, to be loved, to mean something again. Just like she'd want Mr. Boone to be happy instead of spending the rest of his life alone. The ceremony was set for 10 o'clock at the small church in Clearwater. By 9:30, Eleanor was in Samuel's wagon, her son driving with careful attention to every bump and rut in the road. Behind them came Margaret's family and neighbors who'd become friends over the years. The whole community was coming to witness this union, this second chance for two people who'd thought their time for such things had passed. The church bells were ringing as they arrived. Eleanor could see people gathered on the steps, could see horses and wagons crowding the small yard. Inside, she knew Silas would be waiting. Nervous, probably, hoping she wouldn't change her mind at the last moment. She wouldn't. She was more certain of this than she'd been of anything in years. Pastor Whitfield met them at the door, his kind face creased in a smile. "Eleanor, you look radiant." Silas is inside, trying very hard not to pace a hole in the floor. "Shall we begin?" The church was full, every pew occupied, people standing in the back. Eleanor recognized faces, neighbors from surrounding homesteads, townspeople she'd known for years, ranch hands from the Rocking Bee, dressed in their Sunday best. Jack Riley sat in the front row, looking uncomfortable in a suit, but present nonetheless, and at the altar, Silas Boone waited. He wore a dark suit that made him look distinguished and formal, his injured arm still favored but functional. His eyes found Eleanor the moment she appeared in the doorway, and the expression that crossed his face, wonder, relief, joy, made her breath catch. Samuel offered his arm, and Eleanor took it. Together they walked down the aisle, past faces that smiled and nodded approval, past Martha dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, past Mr. Chen, who'd closed his store to attend. Every step brought her closer to Silas, closer to this new beginning. Closer to a future she'd stopped believing was possible. When they reached the altar, Samuel placed Eleanor's hand in Silas's with a formality that carried weight. "Take care of my mother," Samuel said quietly, "for Silas's ears only, or you'll answer to me." "I will," Silas promised. "I swear it." Samuel stepped back. And suddenly it was just Eleanor and Silas, standing before Pastor Whitfield. Before the community, before God and witnesses, about to bind their lives together. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Whitfield began, his voice carrying through the small church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Eleanor Briggs and Silas Boone in holy matrimony." Eleanor barely heard the familiar words. She was too focused on Silas, on the way his hand trembled slightly in hers, on the emotion swimming in his eyes. This man, who'd watched over her from a distance, who'd courted her with pressed flowers and honest conversation, who'd been willing to risk rejection to offer her a future, this man was about to become her husband. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," the pastor continued, "but with full understanding of its sacred nature. It is a partnership built on trust, respect, and love. Silas, Eleanor, do you come here today of your own free will, ready to commit yourselves to each other for as long as you both shall live?" "We do," they said together, voices steady. Pastor Whitfield smiled. "Then let us proceed with the vows." Silas turned to face Eleanor fully, taking both her hands in his. His eyes never left hers as he spoke the words that would bind them. "I, Silas Boone, take you, Eleanor Briggs, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you in sickness and in health, in prosperity and in hardship, for all the days of my life. You have brought light back into my world, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift." Eleanor's voice was strong when she repeated the vows, surprising herself with its certainty. "I, Eleanor Briggs, take you, Silas Boone, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you in sickness and in health, in prosperity and in hardship, for all the days of my life. You have shown me that hope is possible even after loss, and I will spend the rest of my life choosing to be brave enough to hope with you." The rings were simple gold bands, and as Silas slipped one onto Eleanor's finger, his hands shook. Eleanor's hands were steady as she placed his ring, a circle of promise and commitment, of beginning again while honoring what had come before. "By the power vested in me," Pastor Whitfield said, his voice full of warmth and satisfaction, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Silas, you may kiss your bride." Silas stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup Eleanor's face with infinite gentleness. Their kiss was soft, reverent, a promise sealed. Around them the church erupted in applause and cheers, but Eleanor barely heard it. She was lost in this moment, in the warmth of Silas's lips on hers, in the realization that she wasn't alone anymore. Wouldn't be alone ever again. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. Silas's eyes were suspiciously bright, and Eleanor knew hers were too. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pastor Whitfield announced with obvious pleasure, "may I present Mr. and Mrs. Silas Boone." They walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, and Eleanor felt like she was floating. The faces on either side blurred into a sea of smiles and well-wishes. This was real. She was married. She was Eleanor Boone now, beginning a new chapter, while still carrying all the pages that had come before. The reception was held at the Rocking Bee, just as Silas and Eleanor had planned. Long tables had been set up under the shade of cottonwood trees, laden with food the community had contributed, roasted meats and fresh bread, pies and cakes, vegetables from gardens just beginning to produce. Lanterns hung from branches, ready to be lit when evening came. The ranch hands had arranged bales of hay for seating, and someone had set up a small platform for musicians. It was simple but beautiful, exactly what Eleanor had wanted. No elaborate fuss, just family and friends gathering to celebrate. "Mrs. Boone," Silas said as they arrived, trying out her new name. "How does it sound?" "Strange," Eleanor admitted. But good. I'll get used to it. You have the rest of your life to get used to it." They were immediately surrounded by well-wishers. Martha hugged Eleanor so tight she could barely breathe, crying happy tears and declaring she'd known from the start that Eleanor and Silas were perfect for each other. Mr. Chen offered formal congratulations and a gift, a beautiful tea set, that had belonged to his late wife. The ranch hands lined up to shake Silas's hand and kiss Eleanor's cheek, each one welcoming her to the Rocking Bee family. Samuel pulled his mother aside for a quiet moment. "Are you happy, Mama?" "I am. Truly. Good. That's all I wanted to know." He hesitated, then added, "Papa would approve, I think. Mr. Boone, Silas, he's a good man. Different from Papa, but good in his own way. He is. And Samuel, your father will always be your father. Nothing changes that. Silas isn't trying to replace him, I know. But it's an adjustment. Seeing you married to someone else, knowing you won't be at the old homestead anymore, the homestead will always be there. And you'll always have a home here with us. Both things can be true." Margaret was more effusive in her congratulations, hugging both Eleanor and Silas, while her children ran wild with the other ranch children. Freed from the constraint of church behavior. "I'm so happy I got to see this," Margaret said. "Mama, you look 10 years younger." "Marriage agrees with you already." Ada was quieter, standing a little apart, watching the celebration with a smile that didn't quite hide her sadness. Eleanor found her daughter by the punch bowl and pulled her close. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "Nothing. Everything's perfect. I'm going to miss you, Mama. I'll be in Helena, and you'll be here starting this new life, and everything's changing so fast. Change isn't always bad. Look at me. I'm terrified and excited and grateful all at once. But Ada, you'll always be my daughter. Distance doesn't change that. And you'll write to me, and I'll write to you, and we'll visit when we can. I know. It's just, I've been taking care of you for so long, worrying about you, and now suddenly I don't need to anymore. It's like I've lost my purpose." Eleanor turned her daughter to face her, hands on her shoulders. "Your purpose is to live your own life, to teach, to learn, to become the woman you're meant to be. Not to take care of your mother. I'm proud of you, Ada. So proud. And I'll be here, cheering you on from afar, every step of the way." The musicians began to play, and Silas appeared at Eleanor's elbow. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Boone?" It was the same question he'd asked her that night at the prairie supper, when this had all begun. But now it meant something different. Now she wasn't pretending. Now she was his wife, and he was her husband. And the dance they were beginning would last the rest of their lives. They moved to the center of the cleared space that served as a dance floor, and Silas's arms came around her with a familiarity that felt both new and ancient. They swayed to the music, and Eleanor remembered that first dance. The nervousness and uncertainty, the fear of hoping for something she didn't think she could have. "Thank you," Silas said quietly. "For what?" "For saying yes. For taking a chance on a lonely old rancher with a big empty house and no idea how to court a woman properly. You courted me just fine. Pressed flowers and honest conversation and patience. That was exactly what I needed. Even the terrible proposal. Even that. It brought everything to a head, made us both confront what we really wanted. So in a way, your terrible proposal was perfect," Silas laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Only you would find perfection in disaster. I'm good at making the best of things. 3 years of widowhood taught me that." Around them, other couples joined the dance. Samuel with a young woman from town Eleanor didn't recognize. Margaret and William, moving with the ease of long partnership. Jack Riley, looking extremely uncomfortable, being dragged onto the floor by Martha Hendricks. Even some of the ranch hands paired off, dancing with more enthusiasm than skill. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The lanterns were lit, adding their warm glow to the twilight. Music played, food was eaten, toasts were made. Martha's toast brought tears. Samuel's toast brought laughter. Ada's toast brought both, a perfect tribute to her mother's strength and her new beginning. As night fell fully and stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, Eleanor found herself standing at the edge of the celebration, Silas beside her, watching their community dance and laugh and celebrate their union. "Happy?" Silas asked. "Very. You?" "More than I ever thought I'd be again." He pulled her close, and Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, careful of his healing wound. "Do you know what the best part of today was? The ceremony, the dancing, the food. The moment when Pastor Whitfield said your name, Eleanor Boone, that's when it really hit me. You're mine now. We're partners. We're family. All the loneliness, all the years of rattling around in that big house by myself, it's over. I get to wake up next to you tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day after, for as long as we both shall live." Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. "I get that too. No more empty house, no more silence. No more pretending I'm fine when I'm not. I get to have you, your terrible coffee-making, your dry humor, your kindness, all of it. Every day, my terrible coffee-making. It's dreadful, Silas, truly dreadful. But I'll teach you." He kissed the top of her head. "I'll let you teach me anything you want, so long as you keep looking at me the way you're looking at me right now. And how am I looking at you? Like I'm worth hoping for. Like the future might actually be good, instead of just bearable. Like love is possible even after everything." Eleanor pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "It is possible. We're proof of that. 2 lonely hearts who found each other, who were brave enough to try, who chose hope over fear. If that's not love, I don't know what is." They kissed again, a soft pressing of lips that promised tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, all the tomorrows they'd been given a second chance to share. Behind them, the party continued, but for this moment they stood apart, just the 2 of them under the stars. Newly married and no longer alone, the prairie stretched out in all directions, vast and beautiful and harsh. But Eleanor wasn't afraid of it anymore. She had Silas, and Silas had her, and together they were strong enough to face whatever came next. The night air had turned cool, carrying the scent of prairie grass and wood smoke from the dying fires. Most of the families had packed up their wagons and headed home, leaving behind only the sound of crickets and the soft murmur of voices from the few couples still lingering near the lanterns. Eleanor stood at the edge of the clearing, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, watching the last stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. She should leave. Sarah and Daniel had already taken the wagon back an hour ago, trusting she'd find a ride with one of the neighbors. But Eleanor hadn't moved. Something kept her rooted to this spot, something she couldn't quite name. A feeling both terrifying and exhilarating that tonight had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Cold, Silas appeared beside her, 2 tin cups in his hands. He offered her one, and she took it, grateful for the warmth seeping through the metal into her palms. "A little," she admitted. "I should have left with the children." "I'm glad you didn't." They stood in comfortable silence, sipping what tasted like spiced cider someone had kept warm by the fire. Eleanor was acutely aware of how close he stood, how the evening had shifted something fundamental between them. The pretending had stopped hours ago, somewhere between the second dance and the moment he'd told her about his daughter. "Eleanor," Silas said quietly, and the way he spoke her name made her heart constrict. "I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you true." She turned to face him, seeing worry lines around his eyes that she hadn't noticed before. In the dim light, he looked older, more vulnerable than the confident cattleman who'd approached her at the beginning of the evening. "When I asked you to pretend tonight," he continued, "I told myself it was just to help you out, to quiet the gossips and give you an evening of peace. But that wasn't the whole truth." Eleanor's breath caught. "What was the truth?" "I've been watching you for 2 years, Eleanor. Ever since I saw you at the general store, arguing with old Patterson about the price of flour. You stood your ground with such dignity, such quiet strength. I wanted to know you then, but I didn't know how. A man like me, with my reputation and my money, people see what they want to see. They don't see the loneliness." He set his cup down on a nearby fence post and took hers as well, then gently took both her hands in his. His palms were rough and warm, a workingman's hands despite his wealth. "I'm 53 years old," Silas said. "I've built an empire in cattle, bought more land than any man needs, and I come home every night to an empty house that echoes. My daughter writes me letters from Boston, but she has her own life now. My son runs the northern ranch and barely speaks to me. I've spent 30 years building something, Eleanor, and somewhere along the way I forgot to build a life worth living." Eleanor felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Silas, let me finish, please. I need to say this while I have the courage." He squeezed her hands gently. "Tonight, dancing with you, talking with you, just sitting beside you and feeling like someone actually saw me. Not Silas Boone, the cattle baron, but just Silas, just a man. It reminded me what I've been missing, what I've been too afraid to reach for." "What are you saying?" Eleanor whispered, though her heart already knew. "I'm saying I don't want this to end at midnight like some fairy tale. I'm saying that pretending to be your husband tonight made me realize how much I want it to be real." He paused, searching her face. "I'm saying I'm falling in love with you, Eleanor Briggs, and I know it's sudden and maybe foolish, but at my age, I've learned that life's too short to waste time on things that don't matter, and too precious to let go of things that do." The world seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, loud and insistent in her ears. Every practical thought she'd ever had about propriety and caution screamed at her to step back, to protect herself, to remember that she'd already loved and lost once and barely survived it. But there was another voice, quieter but stronger, that remembered how it felt to dance in his arms, how it felt to laugh again, to be seen as a woman and not just a widow or a mother, how it felt to hope. "I'm scared," she said, her voice breaking. "Samuel's death nearly destroyed me, Silas. It took everything I had just to keep breathing, to get out of bed each morning for the children. I don't know if I'm strong enough to risk that kind of pain again." "I'm scared too," Silas admitted. "I've been alone so long, I'm not sure I remember how to let someone in. I'm set in my ways, probably more stubborn than I should be, and I carry regrets that wake me up at 3 in the morning." He lifted one hand to gently cup her cheek. "But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to try." Eleanor closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. She thought of Sarah's words that afternoon, "You can't hide here forever." She thought of the empty house waiting for her, the silence that would only grow deeper when the twins left. She thought of all the years stretching ahead, years she could spend safe and alone, or years she could spend taking a chance on something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I don't even know if I remember how," she whispered. "How to be with someone, how to open my heart again. We'll figure it out together." Silas's thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Eleanor. I'm not asking you to give up your independence or your farm or anything that matters to you. I'm just asking for a chance. Let me court you properly. Let me take you to dinner in town, ride out to see your land, sit on your porch and talk until the stars come out. Let me show you that love doesn't have to end at 41, that there's still time for us." "People will talk," Eleanor said, but she was already softening, already feeling the walls around her heart beginning to crack. "Let them talk. I stopped caring what people thought about me years ago." He smiled, that warm, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "Besides, after tonight they're already talking. Might as well give them something worth gossiping about." Eleanor laughed despite herself, a sound that felt rusty but real. She looked up at him, this man who had appeared in her life, like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying, and felt something shift deep in her chest. Not the desperate, all-consuming love of youth, but something deeper, a recognition, a coming home. "One dinner," she heard herself say. "One dinner and we'll see." "One dinner," Silas agreed, but his eyes were shining with hope. "May I kiss you, Eleanor? Just once, so I know this is real." Her answer was to rise up on her toes and meet him halfway. The kiss was gentle, tentative, the kiss of two people who'd forgotten how but were willing to remember. It tasted of cider and possibility, of second chances and hard-won wisdom. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor was trembling, but not from the cold. "I should get home," she said, though she made no move to leave. "I'll drive you." Silas offered his arm, and this time when she took it there was no pretending. "And Eleanor?" "Thank you." "For what?" "For being brave enough to say yes. For giving an old cowboy a reason to believe in tomorrow." As they walked toward his carriage, Eleanor looked up at the stars scattered across the Montana sky like diamonds on velvet. Samuel was gone, and she would always carry that loss. But she was still here, still alive, still capable of feeling her heart beat faster at a man's touch. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Behind them, the last lantern flickered and went out, leaving only moonlight to guide them home. And somewhere in the darkness, Eleanor Briggs stopped being just a widow, just a mother watching her children leave, and became simply a woman again, one brave enough to reach for happiness one more time. The pretending was over. The truth was just beginning.